He invited her onto the stage to humiliate her in front of hundreds of people, never imagining that 12 minutes later, his hands would be trembling over a chessboard he could no longer understand. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because these stories of dignity, justice, and unforgettable reversals happen every single day, and you do not want to miss the next one. Now, back to Evelyn Carter. The Grand Lexington Ballroom in Manhattan glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Marble floors reflected soft golden light, while waiters in black suits carried silver trays between rows of wealthy donors, reporters, and elite chess enthusiasts gathered for one of the most anticipated exhibitions in the country. At the center of the room stood Victor Hale, America's reigning chess master, famous not only for his brilliance but for his arrogance. At 46, Victor carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent years crushing opponents in silence while cameras flashed around him. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his silver cufflinks shimmered beneath the lights, and his smile held the kind of superiority that made weaker men nervous. Tonight's event was supposed to be another effortless performance. 20 amateur challengers, one legendary champion. Victor would dismantle them all while the audience applauded his genius. The giant digital timer above the stage glowed bright red as spectators filled every seat in the ballroom. Some whispered predictions. Others sipped champagne while discussing opening theory they barely understood. Then Victor's eyes drifted toward the very back corner of the room. A woman sat quietly near the wall beside the emergency exit sign, almost invisible among the expensive dresses and tailored jackets surrounding her. Evelyn Carter wore a faded cream sweater beneath an old brown coat, her light blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck. A worn paperback chess guide rested in her lap beside a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. She looked completely out of place. A few nearby guests glanced at her with subtle confusion before returning their attention to the stage. Victor smirked the moment he saw her. To him, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong ballroom by mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced loudly into the microphone, his voice echoing across the marble walls, "I think we may have one more challenger tonight." The room turned toward Evelyn instantly. She looked up slowly, surprised by the sudden attention. Victor pointed directly at her. "How about the quiet lady in the back? You came all this way. Surely you know how the pieces move." Laughter scattered across the ballroom, not cruel enough to seem dangerous, just enough to humiliate. Evelyn's blue eyes lowered briefly toward the chessboard on the stage. "I'm only here to watch," she answered softly. Victor leaned back with a grin as cameras turned toward her face. "Come on," he said. "It'll entertain the crowd." More laughter followed. The announcer chuckled nervously while several guests lifted their phones to record what they assumed would become an amusing social media clip before the night ended. But near the ballroom entrance, an elderly man in a navy overcoat stopped smiling the moment he saw Evelyn stand from her chair. His expression changed instantly. Because unlike everyone else in that room, he recognized her. The ballroom remained suspended in uneasy silence as Evelyn Carter slowly made her way toward the stage. Her shoes made soft sounds against the polished marble floor while hundreds of eyes followed her every step. Some guests exchanged amused smiles. Others lifted their phones higher, eager to capture what they assumed would become a humiliating spectacle before the evening ended. Victor Hale stood beside the chess table with one hand casually resting on the back of his chair, looking entirely entertained by the situation he had created. "Take your time," he said with a smirk. "Chess can be overwhelming under pressure." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience again. Evelyn said nothing. She climbed the small platform quietly, her old brown coat folded neatly over one arm. Up close, the contrast between them felt almost theatrical. Victor looked polished and powerful beneath the stage lights. Evelyn looked like someone who had spent her evening reading alone in a public library. But the elderly man near the ballroom entrance continued watching her with growing concern. Arthur Bennett had spent 40 years around professional chess circles, and there were details ordinary people never noticed. The way Evelyn's eyes briefly scanned the board before sitting down, the calm rhythm of her breathing, the complete absence of nervous movement in her hands, those were not the habits of a beginner. Victor pulled out her chair with exaggerated politeness. "Ladies first," he announced loudly. "I would not want anyone saying I intimidated my opponent." More scattered laughter followed. Evelyn sat down slowly, smoothing the sleeves of her cream sweater before resting her fingertips lightly beside the board. The digital chess clock glowed between them like a countdown waiting to begin. "Do you know tournament rules?" Victor asked. "Enough," Evelyn replied softly. Her voice barely carried beyond the microphones, but something about her tone caused Arthur Bennett's expression to tighten further. Victor leaned back slightly. "Enough," he repeated. "That is an interesting answer." Across the ballroom, waiters had stopped moving entirely. Even the donors seated near the front now watched with curiosity instead of amusement. The room no longer felt like a charity exhibition. It felt like something unpredictable had quietly entered the air. Victor reached for the Black King and rotated it casually between his fingers. "Tell you what," he said, "we will make this simple. 5-minute blitz. If you survive longer than 10 moves, I will personally applaud you." The crowd chuckled again. Evelyn looked down at the board for several seconds before speaking. "That seems unnecessary." Victor smiled wider. "Afraid? No," Evelyn answered calmly. "Just inaccurate." A few people exchanged surprised looks at the response. Victor's smile faded for only a fraction of a second before returning. "Confident for someone carrying a beginner's guide," he replied, glancing toward the paperback book she had left near the stage stairs. Evelyn's eyes briefly shifted toward it. "It was my father's," she said quietly. Something in the way she said those words caused the laughter around the ballroom to weaken slightly. Victor pressed the clock button. "White moves first." The digital timer began counting down instantly. Evelyn stared at the board without touching a piece. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Victor smirked at the audience as if proving his point, but Arthur Bennett suddenly stepped forward from the back of the ballroom, his voice low with disbelief. "No," he whispered to himself. "It cannot be her." Because in that exact moment, Evelyn Carter finally lifted her hand toward the board, and Arthur recognized the opening position before she even touched the first pawn. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the white pawn for just a moment before she moved it forward with calm precision. The soft click of wood against the board echoed, strangely loud through the ballroom. Arthur Bennett's face lost all color almost instantly. Around him, the audience saw only an ordinary opening move. But Arthur recognized something deeper hidden inside the position. It was not the move itself. It was the timing, the confidence, the exact pressure behind it. Victor Hale barely glanced at the board before making his own response almost immediately. His hand moved with practiced speed, pressing the chess clock hard enough to create a sharp snapping sound that bounced across the microphones. "Good," he said casually. "At least you know how to start." A few guests laughed quietly again, though less confidently than before. Something about Evelyn's composure was beginning to make the room uneasy. She did not look embarrassed anymore. She looked focused. The game continued. Victor attacked aggressively from the very beginning, developing pieces at blitz speed while barely looking at the board between moves. Every action felt theatrical, designed to entertain the wealthy crowd surrounding the stage. He leaned back confidently after each turn, occasionally sipping water while cameras flashed around him. Evelyn, however, remained almost perfectly still. Her pale blue eyes tracked every square carefully. She touched each piece gently before moving, never rushing, never hesitating for long. 10 moves passed, then 12. Victor's smile slowly began to tighten around the edges because Evelyn was not collapsing. She was not panicking. In fact, she was guiding the pace of the game far more than anyone realized. Arthur Bennett stepped closer toward the front row, unable to look away anymore. Memories from nearly 20 years earlier had begun resurfacing in painful detail. A teenage girl sitting across from European grandmasters. International headlines calling her the future of American chess. Analysts stunned by impossible combinations that seemed to appear from nowhere. Then suddenly, one day, she vanished completely. No interviews, no farewell tournament. Nothing. And now, she sat here beneath ballroom chandeliers wearing an old sweater while Victor Hale unknowingly walked straight into something he could not yet see. Interesting, Victor muttered quietly after Evelyn developed her bishop. His voice had changed slightly. The playful arrogance was beginning to fade. He leaned closer toward the board for the first time that evening. Evelyn said nothing. The digital clock continued counting down in glowing red numbers above them. 4 minutes and 11 seconds for Victor, 4 minutes and 22 seconds for Evelyn. A group of college players near the front exchanged nervous looks. One of them whispered, "She is controlling the center." Another shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered back. "She is baiting him." Victor suddenly accelerated his attacks, pushing pieces forward with greater force now, trying to regain psychological control of the match. "You have studied a little more than beginner books," he admitted with a dry smile. "That surprises me." Evelyn calmly adjusted one of her pawns. "My father believed chess revealed character," she answered softly. Victor smirked faintly. "And what does it reveal about me?" For the first time, Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. The ballroom seemed to shrink into silence around them. "That you are impatient," she said. The room went completely still. Victor's fingers froze above the board for half a second. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the announcer stopped smiling, because suddenly the match no longer felt amusing. It felt dangerous to Victor's pride. He answered with a sharp knight move meant to pressure her queen's side immediately. Confident. Aggressive. The kind of move that usually forced weaker opponents into defensive mistakes. But the moment Evelyn saw it, something almost invisible changed in her expression. Not fear, recognition. Slowly, she reached forward and moved her knight into position with complete certainty. Arthur Bennett exhaled in disbelief the instant the piece touched the board. "Oh no," he whispered under his breath. She saw it already. Because Victor Hale had just made the first real mistake of the night, and Evelyn Carter had been waiting for it. Victor Hale stared at the board a little longer than before, and for the first time that evening, the confidence in his posture no longer looked effortless. It looked forced. The ballroom remained wrapped in tense silence while guests leaned closer in their seats, trying to understand what had changed. Only minutes earlier, the match had been entertainment. Now even people who barely understood chess could feel the pressure tightening around the stage like invisible wire. Victor tapped one finger lightly against the edge of the table while studying Evelyn's knight placement. It was subtle, elegant, completely defensive on the surface, yet somehow his entire attack had slowed the moment she played it. "Interesting choice," Victor finally said, though his voice lacked the casual amusement it once carried. Evelyn folded her hands quietly in her lap. "Thank you." Her calmness unsettled him more than any aggressive response could have. Most amateurs became nervous once they realized they were sitting across from someone famous. They rushed. They over-explained. They panicked under attention. Evelyn did none of those things. She simply watched the board with steady blue eyes that seemed to calculate far beyond the visible position. Arthur Bennett could already see the shape forming beneath the surface. Victor had pushed too early, too aggressively. Against ordinary players, his speed alone created panic. Against Evelyn, it created weaknesses. The digital clock above them continued ticking downward in bright red numbers. 3 minutes and 20 seconds remained for Victor. 3 minutes and 48 seconds for Evelyn. Yet somehow it felt like Victor was the one running out of time. One of the younger commentators near the media section adjusted his glasses nervously. "She keeps inviting him forward," he whispered. Why would she want him attacking? An older analyst beside him never looked away from the board, because she already knows where he will land. The realization sent a chill through the small media table. Victor suddenly moved his bishop aggressively across the center line, forcing pressure toward Evelyn's king side. Several audience members nodded approvingly, relieved to see him reclaim control. Victor leaned back slightly with the return of a thin smile. "Still comfortable?" he asked. Evelyn studied the position for several quiet seconds. Then she moved a pawn only one square forward. Softly, calmly, the sound of the wooden piece touching the board echoed through the ballroom again. Victor's smile disappeared immediately. Arthur Bennett lowered his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "My God," he whispered. "She is rebuilding the Tal variation." The nearby spectators exchanged confused looks, but Arthur barely noticed them anymore. He remembered reading old tournament reports late at night nearly 2 decades earlier. Reports describing impossible positional traps created by a teenage American prodigy who disappeared before becoming world champion. Analysts once called her style beautiful because opponents often lost before realizing danger even existed. Victor stared harder at the board now. His fingers hovered uncertainly above his queen before pulling back. For the first time all evening, he was calculating instead of performing. A faint crease appeared across his forehead beneath the bright chandelier lights. "Who taught you?" he asked quietly. Evelyn's eyes never lifted from the pieces. "My father," she answered. Victor scoffed lightly, trying to recover control of the atmosphere. He must have been decent. Evelyn finally looked up at him. He defeated 3 grandmasters before turning 22. The room went silent again. Victor blinked once, only once, but it was enough for Arthur Bennett to notice. Because Victor Hale suddenly understood something deeply uncomfortable. The woman sitting across from him was not surviving through luck. She understood the game at a level that felt terrifyingly familiar. The chess clock continued ticking. 3 minutes remaining now for Victor. Yet instead of attacking, he hesitated again. And in high-level chess, hesitation was often the first visible crack before collapse. Victor Hale adjusted himself in his chair slowly, but the movement no longer carried the relaxed confidence that had defined him earlier in the night. The ballroom lights reflected faintly against the thin layer of sweat now forming near his temples, while hundreds of silent spectators watched the board with growing fascination. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered jokes about the woman in the old sweater sitting across from him. The atmosphere had changed too completely for that. Even the servers standing near the ballroom walls had stopped moving. Every eye remained fixed on the chessboard beneath the chandeliers. Victor reached for his rook, paused, then slowly withdrew his hand again. The hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds, but at this level, 2 seconds revealed fear. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Her expression remained calm, almost distant, but deep inside her mind, the board had already transformed into patterns she understood with frightening clarity. She no longer saw individual pieces. She saw pressure, timing, weakness. Memory returned to her like an old language she had once tried desperately to forget. The smell of tournament halls in Europe, the endless clicking of chess clocks, reporters crowding hotel lobbies asking questions about the young American prodigy defeating international masters twice her age. Her father sitting beside her after victories, never celebrating loudly, only reminding her that brilliance meant nothing without humility. The strongest player in the room, he once told her quietly, is usually the one speaking the least. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly near her queen as those words echoed through her memory. Across from her, Victor finally committed to another attacking move, pushing his rook aggressively into the center file. Several spectators nodded in relief, eager to believe he still controlled the match. But Arthur Bennett closed his eyes briefly the moment the rook landed. "Wrong," he whispered under his breath. "Completely wrong." A younger player beside him frowned nervously. "But it pressures her king." Arthur shook his head slowly. "No, it walks directly into her structure." Victor leaned back after the move, trying to recover his public image. "You are disciplined," he admitted. "Most amateurs panic long before this stage." Evelyn studied the board quietly before answering. "Most professionals underestimate people long before this stage." The comment landed softly, but its effect spread instantly through the ballroom. Victor's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Several donors exchanged uncomfortable glances, because suddenly the humiliation he intended for Evelyn had begun circling back toward him. The digital timer above the stage continued counting down mercilessly. 2 minutes and 18 seconds for Victor, 3 minutes and 9 seconds for Evelyn. Yet despite having less time, Victor now looked trapped inside calculations that refused to cooperate. His eyes moved repeatedly between the same squares, the same diagonals, the same developing danger he could feel but not fully identify yet. Evelyn gently moved another pawn forward. Simple, quiet, precise. Victor's eyes narrowed instantly. Arthur Bennett exhaled sharply. "There it is," he whispered. She opened the corridor. Near the media section, one commentator leaned toward another. "What corridor?" The older analyst answered without blinking. "The one leading to checkmate." A faint ripple of tension spread through the room. Victor heard none of it. His focus had narrowed completely onto the board now. The crowd, the cameras, the ballroom, all of it had disappeared from his mind. Because for the first time in years, Victor Hale was no longer performing for an audience. He was fighting to survive a position he no longer understood. Evelyn finally lifted her eyes toward him again. Calm, steady, almost compassionate. "You should slow down," she said softly. "The board changes when pride moves too quickly." Victor stared at her in silence. Then, without speaking, he reached for his queen. And the moment his fingers touched the piece, Arthur Bennett's face turned pale. Victor Hale's fingers remained frozen around his queen for several long seconds, while the ballroom sat in absolute silence beneath the warm chandelier light. He had intended the movement confidently at first, another aggressive attack meant to crush whatever resistance Evelyn Carter still possessed. But the deeper he calculated, the more uncertain the position became. Tiny details began surfacing like cracks spreading beneath glass. A diagonal he had ignored earlier. A night angle closing behind his rook. A hidden line opening toward his king. Slowly, Victor released the queen without moving it at all. A murmur spread softly through the audience. Even people with little understanding of chess recognized hesitation when they saw it, and hesitation from Victor Hale felt almost unnatural. Across the table, Evelyn remained perfectly calm. Her hands rested quietly beside the board, while the digital clock continued counting downward in red light. 2 minutes and 4 seconds for Victor. 2 minutes and 51 seconds for Evelyn. Yet somehow, she looked like the only person in the room untouched by pressure. Arthur Bennett folded his arms tightly across his chest, struggling to contain the disbelief building inside him. He remembered exactly why Evelyn Carter disappeared from professional chess 20 years earlier. Her father had died unexpectedly only weeks before the World Junior Championship finals. After that, she vanished completely from tournaments, interviews, rankings, everything. Some believed grief destroyed her career. Others assumed the pressure became too much. But Arthur understood something different now as he watched her sitting calmly beneath the ballroom lights. Evelyn had never lost her brilliance. She had simply stopped needing the world to witness it. Victor finally forced himself to make another move, sliding his queen aggressively across the board in an attempt to regain initiative. The sound of the piece landing echoed sharply through the microphones. Several guests straightened in relief, eager to believe the champion had recovered control. But the instant Evelyn saw the move, her eyes softened slightly with something almost sad. Arthur noticed it immediately. "He missed it," he whispered quietly. Near the media tables, one commentator leaned forward nervously. "Missed what?" Arthur never looked away from the board. "The trap closed 3 moves ago." Victor adjusted his tie and attempted a thin smile toward the audience. "You have talent," he admitted. "Not enough to win this position, but more than I expected." Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on the board. "That is the problem with expectations," she answered softly. "They make people stop observing." Victor's jaw tightened again. He looked back down immediately, recalculating faster now. Harder, more desperately, because something deeply uncomfortable had begun crawling into his thoughts. The position no longer behaved logically. Every attacking route he explored collapsed into complications. Every exchange opened new weaknesses. It felt as though Evelyn had seen the entire structure of the game long before he did. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft ticking of the chess clocks now sounded louder than the crowd itself. No glasses clinked anymore. No whispered conversations remained. Hundreds of wealthy spectators sat motionless while the pressure surrounding the table thickened almost visibly. Then Evelyn finally moved. Her fingers reached calmly toward her bishop. One smooth motion, one precise placement. The piece landed softly beside Victor's queenside structure. Arthur Bennett shut his eyes briefly. "Beautiful," he whispered under his breath. Victor stared at the board without blinking. The color slowly drained from his face as realization began spreading across his expression piece by piece. The bishop move looked harmless at first glance. Defensive even, but hidden beneath it was a sequence so devastating that Victor could suddenly see only fragments of escape remaining. He leaned closer toward the board, his breathing slower now, more careful, more afraid. "No," he muttered quietly to himself. His eyes darted across the position again, then again, then again, but every calculation ended the same way. Evelyn had quietly turned the entire board against him. And for the first time in front of a public audience, Victor Hale realized he might already be losing. Victor Hale remained motionless over the chessboard while the pressure inside the Grand Lexington ballroom became almost unbearable. The glowing red timer above the stage now showed 1 minute and 11 seconds beside his name. Across from him, Evelyn Carter still had more than 2 full minutes remaining, yet she looked untouched by urgency. Calm, patient, certain. Victor's eyes moved rapidly across the board again and again, searching desperately for a line that would free him from the tightening structure surrounding his king. But every variation collapsed into the same terrible realization. Evelyn was not reacting to his strategy anymore. She was directing the entire game. The realization struck his pride harder than any public insult ever could. Around the ballroom, even casual spectators could sense the shift completely now. The famous champion no longer looked dominant beneath the chandeliers. He looked cornered. One young guest near the front whispered nervously to her husband, "Why does he look scared?" Her husband swallowed quietly. "Because she already knows something he does not." Arthur Bennett stared at the board with almost reverent disbelief. "Not just something," he murmured softly. "Everything." Victor suddenly pushed his knight forward in a sharp defensive maneuver, forcing open complications across the center. The move drew several gasps from experienced players seated near the media tables. It was risky, aggressive, the kind of desperate counterplay elite competitors attempted when they sensed danger approaching too quickly. Victor leaned back immediately afterward, breathing harder now. "There," he said quietly, trying to sound confident again. "Now let us see your attack." Evelyn studied the board silently. The ballroom lights reflected faintly in her pale blue eyes while the ticking chess clocks echoed through the stillness. Then slowly, almost gently, she reached toward her queen. Arthur Bennett's face tightened instantly. "No," he whispered under his breath. "She cannot possibly." Evelyn lifted the queen from the board. Several grandmasters seated near the front suddenly leaned forward in confusion. Victor narrowed his eyes, and then she placed the queen directly into danger. A sacrifice. The room inhaled sharply all at once. Even people who barely understood chess recognized the shock spreading across the ballroom. Victor stared at the position, stunned. The queen sat exposed, vulnerable, free for capture. One commentator blinked rapidly at the analysis monitor. "That cannot be correct," he muttered. Another analyst shook his head slowly, eyes widening. "If it works," he whispered, "this is genius." Victor's confidence surged back instantly. He almost laughed in relief. Finally, a mistake. His fingers grabbed the queen without hesitation this time, removing it from the board with visible satisfaction. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience as cameras zoomed closer toward the table. Victor leaned back with the first genuine smile he had worn in several minutes. You played beautifully, he admitted. But brilliance without caution always collapses eventually. Evelyn looked at him quietly. Her expression did not change at all. Does it? She asked softly. Victor's smile faltered slightly. Arthur Bennett suddenly lowered his head into one trembling hand. "Oh my God," he whispered. "He took it." The younger commentator beside him frowned. "What is wrong?" Arthur slowly looked back toward the stage. The queen was never the target. The room fell completely silent again. Victor's eyes snapped back toward the board. Then Evelyn moved. Her rook slid across the open file with smooth precision. Click. A single sound. Clean, final. Victor froze instantly. His face lost color so quickly it seemed unreal beneath the chandelier light. Around the ballroom, players began calculating at the same time, and one by one their expressions transformed into disbelief. The sacrifice had opened everything. The diagonals, the mating net, the trapped king. Every piece Victor still possessed suddenly worked against him instead of protecting him. Evelyn folded her hands quietly after the move. "Check," she said softly. And for the first time in his entire professional career, Victor Hale's hands began to tremble in front of a watching crowd. The moment Evelyn Carter said the word check, the grand Lexington ballroom seemed to stop breathing entirely. Victor Hale remained frozen over the board, his fingers trembling faintly beside the captured queen. He now realized he should never have taken. The glowing red chess clock beside his name continued counting downward, but Victor no longer appeared aware of time at all. His eyes moved frantically across the position in front of him, calculating every possible escape. Knight block. Failed. King retreat. Impossible. Rook defense. Too late. Every line ended the same way. Collapse. Around the ballroom, the silence became almost unbearable. Wealthy donors sat motionless in their velvet chairs, while reporters lowered their cameras slightly, stunned by what they were witnessing. Several grandmasters near the front row had already begun shaking their heads slowly in disbelief. One elderly player removed his glasses entirely, staring at the board with pale astonishment. "It is forced," he whispered quietly. "Every move." Arthur Bennett stood near the stage entrance with tears beginning to form in his eyes, not from sadness, from recognition. He had spent decades watching world champions play extraordinary games, but what Evelyn had created tonight felt different. There was no arrogance in it, no performance, no cruelty, just terrifying precision wrapped inside complete calm. Victor suddenly leaned closer toward the board again, searching desperately for hidden resources. Sweat glistened along his forehead beneath the chandelier light while the audience watched the famous champion unravel in real time. "There has to be something," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn remained perfectly still across from him. Her hands rested calmly together while her pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the position. She looked less like someone defeating a grandmaster and more like someone quietly finishing a conversation she had already understood long ago. The digital timer above the stage flashed 43 seconds beside Victor's name. The pressure inside the ballroom tightened further. One of the younger commentators swallowed nervously into his microphone. "I do not think he can survive this position," he admitted softly. Beside him, the senior analyst exhaled in disbelief. He lost the moment he accepted the queen. Victor suddenly moved his rook in a last desperate attempt to create space for his king. The move landed harder than intended, the sharp sound echoing across the silent ballroom. For half a second, hope flickered across his face again. Then Evelyn calmly reached forward. One move, smooth, effortless. Her bishop slid into position beside the center file. Click. The sound seemed to travel through the room like thunder. Victor's eyes widened instantly. Across the ballroom, several players stood from their seats at the exact same moment. One grandmaster whispered something in Russian beneath his breath while another covered his mouth entirely. The mating net had fully closed now. Every square around Victor's king was poisoned, every defense blocked, every remaining move meaningless. The room had gone completely silent. Victor stared at the board without blinking. Then slowly, almost unwillingly, he looked up at Evelyn Carter for the first time, not with arrogance, not with amusement, but with genuine fear and respect. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Evelyn studied him for a moment before answering. "Someone my father taught not to underestimate people." The words landed softly, but they struck harder than any humiliation Victor had intended earlier that night. His shoulders lowered slightly as the reality settled fully into him now. The audience was no longer watching a famous champion embarrass a quiet stranger. They were watching a man confront the limits of his own ego. The chess clock beside Victor's name dropped to 18 seconds. His hands trembled again as he stared helplessly at the board one final time. Then Arthur Bennett finally stepped forward from the crowd, his voice shaking with disbelief as he looked directly at Evelyn. "After all these years," he whispered, "the Phantom of Prague has returned." And suddenly, the entire ballroom realized this was never an ordinary woman sitting at that chessboard. The words Phantom of Prague spread through the grand Lexington ballroom like an electric current. Guests who had been silently watching the match moments earlier now turned toward one another in shock and confusion, while older chess veterans stared at Evelyn Carter with expressions that bordered on disbelief. Some younger spectators clearly did not recognize the name, but the grandmasters seated near the front absolutely did. 20 years earlier, newspapers across Europe had used that nickname to describe a teenage American prodigy who appeared seemingly from nowhere, defeated elite international players with impossible positional traps, then vanished before reaching the peak of the chess world. Rumors about her disappearance had lived inside professional chess circles for decades. Some believed she suffered a breakdown under pressure. Others claimed personal tragedy forced her away from competition forever. But nobody expected to find her sitting quietly inside a Manhattan ballroom wearing an old sweater while dismantling one of America's greatest champions move by move. Victor Hale looked back down at the board one final time. The glowing red clock beside his name showed only 9 seconds remaining. Yet the timer no longer mattered. The position was dead. Every possible continuation ended in defeat. Slowly, painfully, Victor leaned back in his chair while the realization settled completely into his face. Across from him, Evelyn remained composed, almost gentle in the way she waited without celebration. She did not smile. She did not enjoy his humiliation. That difference struck the audience harder than the victory itself. Victor finally exhaled and extended his trembling hand toward the board. Then, with visible reluctance, he tipped his king onto its side. The sound of the wooden piece touching the board echoed softly through the silent ballroom. For one suspended second, nobody moved at all. Then the room erupted. Applause crashed across the ballroom walls like thunder beneath the chandeliers. Several spectators rose to their feet immediately. Reporters scrambled forward with cameras, while grandmasters exchanged stunned expressions of admiration. One elderly champion standing near the front shook his head slowly and whispered, "I have not seen a positional sacrifice like that in 30 years." Victor remained seated while the applause continued around him. The same man who earlier invited Evelyn onto the stage as a joke now looked smaller somehow beneath the bright lights and towering ballroom ceilings. His pride had not been destroyed by cruelty. It had been dismantled by humility. Evelyn stood quietly from her chair and reached for her old brown coat near the stage stairs. The cameras followed her instantly. "Miss Carter," one reporter called out breathlessly, "why did you disappear from chess?" Evelyn paused for only a moment. Her pale blue eyes drifted briefly toward the chessboard where her father's lessons had lived inside her all these years. Because life became more important than applause, she answered softly. The ballroom fell quiet again. Victor slowly rose from his chair. For several seconds, he simply stood there staring at her while the crowd watched carefully, waiting to see how the famous champion would respond. Finally, Victor lowered his head slightly. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not for losing, for assuming you belonged beneath me before I even knew your name." Evelyn studied him calmly before giving a small nod. Chess reveals character, she answered. My father used to say that. Victor looked back toward the overturned king still resting on the board. His expression tightened with shame and understanding at the same time. Around them, the ballroom lights shimmered across marble floors, while guests continued whispering about the impossible match they had just witnessed. But the most unforgettable moment of the night was not the queen's sacrifice. It was not the checkmate. It was the silence that followed after an arrogant man finally understood the cost of underestimating a quiet woman. And as Evelyn Carter disappeared quietly into the Manhattan night beyond the ballroom doors, an entire room of powerful people was left remembering something they should have known from the beginning. True brilliance rarely announces itself.